Well, there's been an awful lot that's been thrown out on the floor here, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so why don't we do that? Let me start with one of the questions that came in via Twitter so that we can acknowledge our virtual audience and those who are watching via webcast. And Ashley asked this question to the issue of conflict and creative tension that you mentioned. Is conflict good or bad for collaboration? Teams with conflict can be more innovative, but that conflict can also be disruptive. And the major key, how is the conflict expressed? So you want to address that since you talked about that?
Sure, thank you. Is it my phone?
It should be on. It should just go on unless you turn it off.
Okay, that's better. So in terms of conflict being good or bad for teams, there's two things I like to differentiate between. First is, what is the type of conflict? Is it a conflict about the task itself, or is it about the relationship between the groups? Number one. And number two, how is the conflict managed? Is it managed more collaboratively or competitively? So there isn't an easy answer. We used to think that task conflict was good and relationship conflict was bad, or the interpersonal. But what the literature shows through a meta-analysis is that there's so much variance in task conflict effects on team outcomes that you really have to start looking at all those what-ifs. Conflict expression matters, conflict management matters, and we really need to understand this whole dynamic better.
And David, how do you manage conflicts across your boundaries?
So in the organizations that I've studied, those conflicts tend to be larger than the organization. They tend to be larger
than the organization.
Larger political kinds of conflicts. And the ways that boundary organizations have addressed them successfully is by internalizing them and making a sort of private space where those things can be negotiated outside of the public eye, and so that the sort of larger political meaning of those conflicts gets submerged to the particular task at hand.
Okay. I'm going to come to the floor in a minute, but I have one that I'd like to come back on the issue of the conversation, which you were talking about, because there's some question about what is the conversation, for those who might be unfamiliar with it, what attributes, and I say this with my friends from the conversation in the room, this is not being done to make you happy, but to perhaps clarify, what metrics give you some confidence that what you're citing is actually scientifically viable?
So if you're unfamiliar with the conversation, you should go to it immediately and read it. It's essentially taking academics, drawing on their own research, normally to address events of the day, so things going on in the world. So it's kind of like a platform for op-eds, but informed by people's actual research with links to the underlying research. So it's credible people. They have editors who are really, really good at what they do. So they take my jumble of garbage and turn it into readable prose. That's fun to read. And the model is that they post something and then allow endless republication as long as you attribute it, you don't change the content and you attribute it to the conversation. And so I had something that I wrote that got picked up by the New Republic and Time Magazine and Newsweek, and they don't have money to pay reporters anymore, and they're hungry for content, and the conversation is good content. And so they republish that work. If you're an author for the conversation, you get a little dashboard that tells you how many reads have you gotten on every format in every country, broken down by time with cumulative information. So you get this wonderful insight about who's reading it, and then you can engage with different constituencies. So if it's on the New Republic and they have a comment section, you can engage with them. So
I think a very important point to point out here, because this also illustrates the changing ecosystem of media, is that it's by no means, and not even largely, the top-down model. Time Magazine, nobody buys Time Magazine. I mean, some do, but these are not the models that dominate anymore, and there are many more ways to influence the conversation, both literally and figuratively. Let's go to the floor. There's a question in the back there, and we're going to move to the back of the room because we love you. So, question, mic's coming to you. Stand so we can see you, and go ahead.
I'd like to ask the panel if they could speak a little bit more to the conflict between the passion that scientists obviously have for their work, but the need to be objective when expressing that.
Who wants to take that on? Go ahead.
I'll start very briefly. One of those slides that I had to skip over very quickly was about dance. One of my faculty members, Kiki Jenkins, did her research on sea turtles and how innovation, grassroots innovation among fisher folk can prevent bycatch of sea turtles. And she's incredibly passionate about sea turtles. And she participated in AAAS's Dance Your Dissertation competition. Was an honorable mention there, and has continued to explore art-science collaborations so that, yes, one half of her brain writes the paper about grassroots innovation and sea turtle exclusion, and the other half of her brain and the rest of her body goes and does science dance performances that indulge that, but we also have the ability, with collaborations at ASU with our Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts, to actually give her academic support, recognize the creative work that goes into her dance, and reward her academically for that.
Kathleen, I wonder if you could comment on that, especially in the context of these sort of hierarchies of credibility, and what happens to credibility if you're taking a position with your passion versus your science.
Well, I don't see being objective and being passionate as two different things. I think that if scientists don't convey the passion that they feel about the work that they're doing, why should anybody else be excited?
But does that turn them into advocates and then taint their point of view in the eyes of many or some?
Well, there is some research indicating that you can be passionate. I mentioned in my talk, though, that if you seem to be advocating for a policy as opposed to advocating for the importance of the problem that you're looking at. Yeah, or the importance of the information. Once you start saying, you know, and the solution to this problem is X, you begin to lose credibility, and what you say will be discounted. But I think that, again, there's a tremendous amount of work out there looking at affect and the importance of affect, right? System 1 and System 2 thinking. And, you know, the emotions kick in before your intellect kicks in. So you have to speak to that.
So there's what I'd like to take as a follow-on here from Ed at NOAA, who asks specifically, can you address then the importance of the messenger versus the message in the identification of trusted agents in communities for stakeholders?
Well, that is a tough one. So, I mean, you want someone to be speaking who's engaging and listenable and has fun things to say, and it's hard to do that if you're talking about your p-values and sort of, you know, speaking scientificese. But I don't know that we can separate anymore the politics and the science. Science has become politicized in a way that we didn't think that we would fall victim to, but we're now in a world where that's the way it is. It is taken as political, whether we want it that way or not. And
across the board, or just some of this, or the science in these highly controversial areas of GMO or vaccinations or climate change that are so in the media all the time?
Yeah, in the social sciences, it's almost inescapable. People are going to find what you research to be political, whether you want it that way or not. In the natural sciences, anything that offends oil companies is probably more likely to be seen as controversial, but yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dynamic going on in social science right now in terms of sound bites, picking up findings, getting proliferated, and it's losing the value system that science is cumulative. And so when individual studies get a lot of press or an individual researcher pushes out findings from a small set of studies, it becomes truth. And then when it's discounted or new results conflict with it, we all run into problems. And we understand in science that's part of the process, but I think in the press it becomes more of an issue.
And I think the social sciences are in a particular bind here because on the one hand, to the extent that they're more qualitative and more nuanced, they can be dismissed as storytelling. As they become more quantitative and detailed, then the Supreme Court dismisses them as abstruse and irrelevant. And so the social sciences have, I think, a particular challenge in this regard.
Strikes me that we don't, you know how we have disclaimers with certain stories, almost like we need a claimer with every one of these stories that explains fundamentally what science is to the reading public or the viewing public, because there's so little awareness of this notion of cumulative information and knowledge and all. All right, back to this, down to the aisle here, and then I'm going to go back up to the top.
I have a question about that fantastic tsunami video. Can you tell me a little bit about the process, the evidence-based process that went into developing that, and how that may have impacted the creative team that created that video, and how you measured the impact of it on your target audience?
Great questions.
The video itself was a collaboration between USGS and the Art Center College of Design, which is in Pasadena. So there were video producers that were involved. There was input from scientists, from organizations like the Center for Public Health and Disasters. And the idea, what they were looking for in the video was to create learning around 3 areas: tsunami characteristics, tsunami warning signs, and self-protective actions. So they were very specific in terms of what they were looking for. Then our center came in and did a series of focus groups with a pre-test, post-test design, answering questions in those 3 areas before seeing the film, after seeing the film, and 4 weeks later. There were open-ended and closed-ended items, a lot of feedback. People could write in feedback, found out that people from certain groups, like people who had relatives in the Indian Ocean region and in Japan, didn't really think that tsunamis were all that funny.
Exactly.
Didn't like the humor. Some said the video was cheesy. Others said it was cheesy, but they liked it.
Did you find
they
a
liked the
big
cheesiness.
demographic breakdown? Because we talked audience earlier.
Yeah.
You had a very specific audience in mind. Did it work with that audience?
They thought it should be targeted to a younger audience.
Wait, the young audience thought it should be targeted to a younger?
Even younger, yes. And found out a lot of things about ethnic differences, educational level, similarities and differences. No difference between the people who saw the video in the treatment where they saw the video once and when they saw it 3 times. People got it.
It's really interesting.
And it's on YouTube, if you want to look at it again.
Do you want to say something on that? No? All right, back to I said I'd go up. Let me see if I can see in the hand. There we go.
Far left. Someone very enthusiastic on the far left.
I'll get you. I'll come over there next. Promise.
Thank you. I have a question specifically for Jerry. You referred to public policy being informed by stylized facts, which sounds to me a step removed from alternative facts. And I'd love to hear more about what these are and who's providing them to policymakers if it's not economists.
Yeah, so there's different definitions of what counts as a real economist, and I don't want to call anyone out in this context, but there's sort of real economics, which occurs in the journals, and there's stylized economics, which occurs in other contexts. So there are think tanks who generate things that look like economic reports and generate stylized facts that people use to do policy on. So the stylized facts are sort of the tinker toy version of how reality works. If we raise interest rates, X will happen. And it's a very simplified version that's accessible to policymakers. And what I was referring to as the stylized facts we have now might have worked perfectly in the 1970s and don't work today. So if you wanted to change corporate behavior back in the day, we knew how to regulate a Sears or an AT&T or a General Motors as large employers. Those were like regulating dogs. Now we've got this biome, that's an inner biome that's a lot harder to work with. And so the way you deal with a dog wouldn't work with an inner biome. So, yeah, but stylized facts, if you listen to any political discussions of the economy, it's based on a very simplified and unrealistic version of how the economy works. So that's what I meant by stylized facts.
Thank you. To your question, yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Margaret Karembu from Kenya. Kenya is in Africa. Now, scientists I'm a scientist and a science communicator. And one of the biggest challenges we have is the misunderstanding of the audience. From morning, we've been talking about the critical role of understanding your audience to be effective. But in the African context, the big gap that is there, that is a cause of conflict when it comes to collaboration, is when the people who work with the audiences have different understanding from those you collaborate with, especially if they are when they are funders. And one example is really about farmers. The understanding that an American or a European or any other person would have from an African scientist will be very different. Have you, and this is to Laura, have you tried to see how that gap can be bridged so that we can communicate effectively? Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
I didn't get the opportunity to talk about the role of cultural differences in terms of conflict expression and gaps. And so even when you think about the different dimensionality, it's all through the lens of the culture. And so what I think is, say, just in terms of conflict expression, what I consider high intensity, you may not, based on your cultural background and so on. So that always comes into play. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Rwanda visiting a campus we have. We have a master's program there. And well, what we tried to do is hire faculty teaching in this engineering program who are African or trained in Africa, and we're bringing our faculty over from the US to teach in that program. And what works for that program in terms of bridging the cultural gap is that the faculty understand the problems and context. They're immersed in it. And so when they're teaching material and doing research, it's relevant and it's in collaboration with the African scientists. So that's been a really wonderful learning experience and something I'd love to see replicated in other places.
Anybody else want to comment on that? No.
Well, the quick thing is that if you visit any American university with science labs, any given lab is comprised of grad students and postdocs, often from 5 to 10 different cultures. So there's always intercultural fun happening in any science lab in the US. Most grad students in the sciences, I believe, are from outside the US at this point. And so you always get interesting mixes.
We are up against our time, but there's a very thoughtful and interesting question that's come to us via Twitter, appropriately enough, that I'd like to ask each of you about, to be very, very brief with a response, because I think you could probably do that. And it starts with actually, it's from AmSci Mag, American Science, and it connects to a short quote from an article, which reads as follows. This was the link. Over the next few years, if there's to be any possible silver lining, it will be that leaders of the scientific community break out of a culture of complacency, ending a long-standing reticence to confront the profound, dire problems we now face. The question is as follows. How can we end the crisis of complacency in science? Will it take greater financial investment in local nonprofit media? Let me ask each of you this is the TV in me, right? Forcing the communicator in you in 15 or 20 seconds so that we can get everybody out to lunch, to address how to end, or you think an idea to end the crisis in complacency, and whether it takes that financial investment in local nonprofit media.
Okay. I'm not sure there's a crisis of complacency among the youngest cohort who are coming in, say, to their university positions. We've looked at the attitudes of particularly engineering students as they come in, and they come into engineering wanting to change the world, and there's something about the engineering curriculum that when they get out, they just want a job. So my 15 to 20 seconds is, let's look at the curriculum and see what's squeezing that passion, that desire, that ability to change the world out of them.
So teach passion. Laurie?
It's teaching communication skills. So I always say, if you can explain your research to your mother, your sister, your son, your nephew, someone who's not an expert, that's the first litmus test, is to be able to make that translation and get someone else excited about what you're excited about. We do it in the classroom, and so if we can pull it to the next level outside of our teaching into the community, I think that will be a big plus.
David.
Try to solve a real problem in the world. Trying to take your ideas and butt them up against reality and actually solve a problem, you'll see the limitations of what you're doing, and you'll have to communicate with the prospective beneficiaries.
Greater financial investment in local nonprofit media?
Sure.
Kathleen.
This is going to sound terribly blue skies, but we need to change the reward system in academia. You know, it sounds like a bridge too far, but until communication and engagement is baked into the merit review process in universities, it's not going to happen.
Well, there is a deliciously snarky question from Allison at UC Davis. How did the conversation piece rate in tenure evaluation versus the book nobody read?
Both count for nothing.
So on that note, I think it's time for lunch.